Okay.
Hey, how
Hello,
you?
Ty. How are you?
Great. How are you?
Fine, thanks. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Yeah, yeah, Ty, like Italian shoe.
Okay. That's a nice name.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. So how you feeling today?
I'm fine. How are you?
Good, I'm good. I was having a little bit of a connectivity issue in Africa, so I apologize about the delay. If I didn't already tell you, I'm in West Africa, so we're not as technologically advanced.
Okay. You're in Ghana, right?
Yes, yes. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah. Yeah. I live in Columbus, and Cleveland is a great city.
Thank you, thank you. I appreciate that. I know you got a lot of business to take care of. So I appreciate you taking out your time to come on the show. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and it's definitely an honor. And for the
Thank
viewers,
you.
yeah, no
Thanks. I'm
doubt.
glad to be here.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. So for the viewers who may not recognize you, could you let them know who you are and definitely?
Okay. Is the interview formally starting now?
Yeah, we could get started.
Okay. All righty. Hi, everybody. My name is Professor Joan Cashin. My last name is Cashin. I teach at the Department of History at Ohio State University. I've been teaching there since 1992, and I have a doctorate from Harvard University.
That's amazing. You've been teaching history longer than some people have been alive, or longer than some people, work a job.
Yeah, I've been at Ohio State a long time. I published 6 books. They cover the time period from the early 19th century to the late 19th century, what historians call the early national period, the antebellum period, and of course the Civil War and post-war period. I'm interested in social, economic, and cultural history. I'm interested in gender, race, material culture, how people remember and interpret historical events.
Some very powerful time periods. Now, I can ask you, when did you develop a passion for history? Like, have you always been like a history buff, or is it something you kind of got into later on in life?
Well, that's a good question. When I was a college student at American University in Washington, D.C., I took history and literature courses, American history and American literature, and I loved them both. I was an American studies major because it basically allowed me to double major. But I realized that I loved history more. As much as I love literature, I loved history even more. So I decided to go to graduate school in that field.
Okay.
And, and over the years, I have enjoyed it as much as I hoped I would. I really do feel fortunate. I was able to go into an occupation where I enjoy just about every aspect of the job.
That's inspiring because you not only made a career out of it, but you developed a passion for it to the point where you actually doing research and finding more history and sharing it with people. I feel like that can be very empowering for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I love the research. I love the writing. I love teaching. And I not only teach undergraduates and graduate students at Ohio State, but I also try to engage with the public, the general reader, whenever I possibly can. So I've done a lot of public history lectures. I've done podcasts. I've done some interviews, and it's been really fun.
Yeah, definitely. History is fun. Now, I want to ask you about your book, War Stuff. What
Mm-hmm.
kind of inspired you to even go that far to say, I want to write a book?
Well, that's a good question. Over the years, when I was working on different projects, I kept coming across material about soldiers in both armies confiscating things from civilians, from white civilians in the South and the border states during the war. And I would take notes on it off and on. And I thought to myself, gee, this is happening a lot. This is not the occasional isolated incident. This is happening on a mass basis, really. And I wondered, aren't there regulations that cover this sort of thing? And I started researching that, and I began to realize that there was enough going on here to write a book about it. So that's how War Stuff came about.
That definitely sounds like a very interesting perspective. So I can ask you about how long did it take you to do the research and write and edit and publish the book?
It took about 10 years. It was a long journey. I started the research in 2008, and the book came out in 2018 with Cambridge University Press. I should also mention that the book has been translated into Russian. It was translated last year by Academic Studies Press. You can find it on the Academic Studies Press website. It's the first book on the Civil War to be translated into this language. And of course, the English language version can be found on the website for Cambridge University Press.
Also, you're teaching history and making history. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's really nice. I'm really happy to be able to say that the book has been translated into a different language.
Books last forever, so who knows how many more languages it can translate.
Well, that's a very nice thing to say, and I hope that it comes true.
Yeah, definitely. Get that history out there. So I can ask you, now what were some of the struggles between the armies and the civilians? What things in particular were, causing these issues?
There's several different arenas of struggle, we might call it. Both armies need material resources to fight the war. And neither side is very good at supplying the armies. I mean, this is the 19th century. This is before electricity. This is before the internet. So they are delivering supplies to men in the field, usually with horses and wagons, sometimes with the railroads. But of course, both sides are trying to sabotage the railroad lines. And sometimes the supplies are late. Sometimes the drivers get lost. Sometimes the supplies get ambushed and taken away. So what happens is that men out there in the field need certain basic necessities to survive. They have to have food, obviously. Food is essential to our survival. And if the quartermaster has not brought enough food, both armies assert the right to take food from civilians. And the way it's supposed to happen, according to military policy in both armies, is that an officer will go out with some men in the infantry. They will take food, provide paperwork giving information about their identity and stating this is what we have seized today. And then at some point after the war, the civilian is supposed to turn in that paperwork to get it redeemed. But it doesn't really work like that in practice. Sometimes individual soldiers decide if they're hungry right now, they're not going to wait for an officer or an official foraging party to put together. And the word forage, Forage, is used as both a noun meaning food and also as a verb meaning to take food. So sometimes 2 or 3 men will slip out of camp at night and head out into the countryside looking for a farm that has what they need. And they take it, hopefully quietly, without waking anybody else up, and then they come back to camp. And then sometimes foraging parties go out as regulations dictate. But even then, sometimes the officers have trouble controlling the men. Sometimes the officers do not appear to be concerned. If the men take every stalk of corn in a field and take every cow in the barn, leaving the family with nothing. So both of the armies do this. I need to emphasize that. the stereotype from the Lost Cause fantasy is that it's the evil Yankee army that takes food from white Southern civilians. Well, it's not like that. Both armies take what they need. And sometimes they feel bad about it. Sometimes Confederate troops express in their diaries or their letters a sense of remorse or guilt. Like maybe this isn't right. This doesn't seem quite ethical, but they go ahead and do it anyway because they have to survive. They need food to survive. Armies also use up a lot of timber. They need wood so they can build their winter quarters. They need plank roads. If the weather is bad and it starts raining and the roads become impassable, they need wood for their campfires. So the same thing happens. Men go out and take timber, and they go out with axes and they chop down and take what they need. And again, sometimes it's an official foraging policy, and sometimes it's unofficial. But the same assumption prevails in both armies. Since they need timber to survive, they can take from civilians. And the same thing happens with housing. If they need a building to use as headquarters or as a military hospital, they just take over the building. And they like big houses, and they like houses on a hilltop because that provides them sight lines, so they can see if enemy soldiers might be approaching. So they just show up at the door and say to the person who answers the door, "We are seizing this house," and they have to give way. Now, when you get into the specifics of food, timber, and housing, the food that they like the most is meat, especially red meat, beef, cattle. It's the staple of the diet before the war. And a lot of soldiers think that it gives them strength, that it gives them endurance, power, and energy. And also they say sometimes in their letters, it just tastes so good. We had beef last night and it was so good. It was so delicious. It's the first time I've had red meat in a month. So they're looking for red meat, although they take just about anything. They take fish, they take vegetables, they take grains. Now with timber, the tree that they're looking for is the pine tree, because the pine grows to great heights. It's also paradoxically easy to chop down, and it's very durable. It lasts a long time if you use it to build, say, quarters for men in the infantry. So when they fan out across the countryside on a foraging expedition looking for timber, they're looking for pine. Although they also chop down oak trees, they take walnuts, they take whatever they need. And regarding the houses, those big houses on hilltops are often occupied by white Southern elites, wealthy people. And they like brick houses because they don't burn down as easily and they're warmer in the winter. So it's ironic that the Confederacy is created largely by the plantation elite, but it's their houses that officers are often looking for if they want a building to serve as their winter headquarters, or they want a building to serve as a military hospital, 2 miles from the Battle of Shiloh, or 3 miles away from Petersburg, Virginia. And both armies do this. This is one of the themes of my book. I found that their behavior is the same, although sometimes Confederate soldiers and officers apologize. Sometimes they do feel bad, as I said. And of course, not all white Southerners support the Confederacy. There's a significant numerical minority who are against the war. The term back then was unionist. That is, the word union with IST on the end. That word is all over the diaries, the letters, and the newspapers. So sometimes federal soldiers, when they realize they're taking food from a unionist family, they feel bad about that. And sometimes they apologize, and there's genuine regret, but they have to have food to survive. So this policy of taking whatever they need starts from the very beginning of the war, and it goes on until the very end.
Wow, wow, that's very informative. I appreciate you taking the time to break it down, like you was talking about the different types of wood and stuff. You know, a lot of people take that information for granted, and a lot of times history, that information could be very useful because you never know what the future holds. You know, you have to at least think about certain things.
Yeah, yes, the phrase that turns up in the letters by the military is the phrase military necessity. And that's the philosophy. And it's in the Articles of War from 1806 that both sides adopt. So there is a theoretical justification, shall we say. But it's something that wreaks havoc on the physical environment, obviously. And sometimes both armies will destroy a food supply to make sure the other army doesn't get it. You know, they'll take what they want and then they burn everything else on a farm. Or they'll take the timber that they need and then they set fire to the rest of the forest. Or they'll take one house and then after they evacuate it, they'll set fire to it so the other army can't get it. And and after a certain point, white Southern civilians, whatever their political views may be, they realize that if an army shows up in the neighborhood, something bad is probably going to happen. And by the last winter of the war, it's clear that the civilian population just wants this to be over. You know, they're tired of the war. It's taking a tremendous toll on them personally, I think in ways that most of them probably didn't anticipate. And there are many accounts of soldiers in both armies talking about if they show up in a little village somewhere, that all the civilians run as fast as they can. You know, they just leave the area as fast as they can get away because they know that those armies show up and that their needs will come first. So in the last winter of the war, you have a phenomenon that perhaps the general reader hasn't necessarily heard about before. You have civilians calling upon the Confederate leadership to end the war. You know, they have public meetings, they write letters, they write letters to Jefferson Davis himself saying, you know, this is too much and the war has to come to an end. So I think this is one of the reasons that the South loses the war, although there are obviously lots of factors involved in every war as to who wins and who loses. But I think if the white civilian population in the South has decided that this is taking too big a toll, then it has to end.
Oh, that sounds so scary, but it's definitely needed information. Now, I can ask you this: at any point where, I guess, were there forced recruitments or people taken captive or things of that nature by the armies coming into the
Sorry, Taye, I didn't hear the first part of the question.
Oh, okay, I'll say that again. So I guess can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess my question is, during this time period, did any of the soldiers or the armies take people captive or recruit them, you know, forcefully recruit them to the armies or anything of that nature?
Are you talking about the slave experience?
Well, I'm saying if, say, for example, if they go into a town and it's young men, they're teenagers, and they say, well, you have to help us fight, anything of that nature. They were just left to be civilians.
Well, yes. I mean, both armies insist at different points in the war that local people have to work for them to meet their needs. Like if they need labor to build a road cutting through a forest, they will just send officers out and they will impress. That's the verb. It means to confiscate. They will impress local workers. And sometimes it's white men and sometimes it's black men. And for the black men, sometimes they're free people and sometimes they're slaves. But the army just asserts we need workers, you know, right now, and they have to come out here and help us dig this trench or, you know, lay this road or whatever. And both armies also take hostages during the war. That's one thing I devoted a good bit of time to in my book. I think scholars haven't quite given that subject the attention it deserves. But they take human beings and use them to try to influence behavior by the other army. So they'll take a civilian who happens to be walking down the street in a small town in Mississippi because one of their officers is being held as a POW and they want him to be released. So they say, you know, until we get our officer back, then we're going to hold this man as a hostage in our camp indefinitely. And thousands of civilians are taken as hostages during the war, and both sides do it. Again, you know, if they think that they're going to try to leverage the other army into doing something, often returning POWs, or sometimes they want their own hostages back. so they'll say, we have 5 hostages here who are pro-Confederate whites being held by the Union Army. The other side, if they release 5 of their hostages, will do an exchange here. Although sometimes there's no numerical equivalency. Sometimes they'll say, we insist if we return this officer to you, that there has to be an exchange of at least 5 men in the infantry, or at least 5 civilians. Now, again, the policy on this allows officers a lot of leeway. But both sides say that they don't think that hostages should be mistreated, you know, especially if they're civilians. But the truth is, a lot of them are mistreated. You know, that sometimes they're just thrown into the county jail. They don't get proper food. There are cases of some of them who got killed trying to escape. Sometimes they're killed by accident, you know, because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time when the armies are evacuating an area. So this notion that I certainly grew up with, I think most of us may have learned this in grade school and high school, is that, you know, civilians are over here and the war is over here. You know, civilians are not involved in the war. They're watching it, they're observing it, but they're not involved in it. The truth is they are deeply involved.
Right, that's definitely true. A lot of people, you know, they take that for granted. Even now, you know, with the technology we have, we see things on TV or on the internet or on YouTube, and easily be caught in the middle of those things. You had spoken on something earlier that I wanted to ask you about slave experience.
Sure.
Is this beneficial to some slaves? Were they able to take advantage of this, or did this make things far worse?
Oh, that's a great question. And the slave experience has been the subject of a very large scholarship. In fact, so much has been done on it that I focused in my book mostly on white civilians. But I'm happy to talk about that. When the war begins, there are 4 million slaves in the South. And of course, not all the slave states join the Union, rather join the Confederacy. 4 of them remain in the Union. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And that, of course, makes things very complicated for President Lincoln. It's not a war of slave states versus free states. If it were, that would have made things a lot easier for him. But in the beginning of the war, as soon as Union troops show up anywhere in the Confederacy in 1861, slaves run away. They run towards the Union Army, and they understand what's at stake here. I mean, it's amazing how quickly information passes through the slave community. You know, some of them are literate, some of them can read newspapers. They often overhear white people talking about military events. So they understand the big picture, you know, that this is a war in which the future of slavery is at stake. And they also know a lot just about, you know, the movements of different armies. So when the armies show up, they run towards those Union armies. And initially, at the very beginning of the war, officers would often turn them away because they didn't know what to do with them, and there's no policy on that. But then an officer, a general named Benjamin Butler, who was stationed in Virginia, sort of, you know, right on the edge of the Confederacy after Virginia joined the Confederacy, he said that slaves should be declared contraband of war meaning that slaves can be used by the Confederacy to help win the war. Therefore, it's in the Union's interest to let them stay if slaves make it to the federal lines. And the US Congress adopts that policy in August of 1861. So that means that they can't escape. That if they make it to the federal lines, then they don't have to go back. And then, of course, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in September of 62. It goes into effect January 1 of 63. And the proclamation allows Black men to serve in the Union Army, because the Army had been all white at the beginning of the war, believe it or not. Black men served in the Revolution. They served in the War of 1812. But at the beginning of this war, it's an all-white army for about 2 years. But when that information starts to spread, more and more Black men run away to make it to the Union lines because they're very eager to fight. They want to participate. They want to help end slavery by serving in uniform. Now, while all that's going on, both armies also impress the labor of slave women. They need women to work as cooks, as laundresses, and they simply, both armies will go through an area and they find slave women and they take them back to the camp and they say, now you're working for us. And sometimes they talk to the slave owner, a white man or a white woman who's on the farm. And if they're pro-Confederate, they might say, well, all right, if this helps the Confederate war effort, okay. Or if they're pro-Union slave owners, they might say, well, all right, I may not like this, but if it helps the war effort, then okay. But some of them don't like it at all and protest vociferously. They write letters. They go to the general's tent and have, angry arguments with him. But most of the time, the army simply assert, we need workers. So they impress slaves. And slave women, just like slave men, they understand what the war is about. And many of them are eager to help out at a Union Army camp. And sometimes they bring their children with them because they don't want their children to be left behind or, God forbid, sold away by the master who gets angry because, a slave woman has suddenly disappeared and is now at a Union Army camp. But in any case, the war presents tremendous opportunities for us slaves, to get away, to escape, and to find relative safety in the federal camps. Now, not every Union officer is egalitarian. Some of them are in favor of emancipation, some of them are not, some of them are indifferent. Some of them just see this as like a practical problem. William T. Sherman doesn't want slaves to come to his camps because he doesn't want to have to feed them. He says that, they're getting in the way of my duties as a military commander. But nonetheless, it does provide this great opening for slaves who may have been daydreaming about this for years, the chance to get away. And of course, before 1861, slaves did run away. And the ones who made it were often men, because most men are stronger than most women. They can run faster, obviously. But what the war does is it opens up opportunities for slave men and slave women to escape. And thousands of them do. In fact, some historians have argued that that's what really matters more than what Lincoln and the Congress are doing in Washington, D.C. As you may know, there's been quite a debate about this, who is really responsible for ending slavery. Some people have said that the slaves, by their own actions, put so much pressure on the military and political establishment that it hastened emancipation. Other people have said, well, actually, no, the head of state is a very powerful individual, especially in time of war. And what really matters is what Lincoln decides to do, because he's at the top of the political system. This debate has gone on for a long time, but in any case, the war does provide opportunities for thousands of people to escape.
Wow, you really went into great detail about that. I appreciate you. I guess I wanted to ask you this. Did you find any evidence of people successfully resisting the armies? I know you had talked about some people they would pack up and just leave, but did anybody try to rebel or fight back in any shape, form, or fashion?
You mean when the armies are taking their material resources? Yes, they did. Some white civilians are very angry. They think this isn't right. And some of them think that their survival matters more than the army. You know, their own family survival, the well-being of their own relatives is much more important. So they start hiding food on their farms, or they'll put it down a well, they'll bury it out in the woods somewhere, and sometimes they go beyond that. Sometimes they will physically attack soldiers who show up, especially if they show up in unauthorized expeditions. If two or three soldiers show up by themselves at a house and they want food, and somebody in that house knows how to handle a gun, sometimes they get fired on. And there are some documented instances of soldiers who were killed when they were foraging in South Carolina, believe it or not. The state that was the first to secede from the Union, the very first state out of the Union. Some foragers were killed and their bodies were left in a public road with a sign around their necks saying forager. This is the message. If you try to take our belongings, you could lose your life. But most of the time, because soldiers have more weapons, especially if they show up in large numbers, an entire company shows up. Most of the time, the armies are able to get much of what they want or need.
Wow, okay, okay. I think we got about 7 more minutes, 5 more minutes. I guess I want to ask you, what was life like for those in the North and the South when the war actually ended? Were they able to rebuild simultaneously, or was it a struggle or difficulty for one another?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, most of the fighting takes place inside the South. There are a few invasions, Maryland in 1862, Pennsylvania in 1863. Lee gets turned back at Gettysburg. Also, a few forays by Confederate cavalry into the lower Midwest. But most of the fighting is in the South, and the region's infrastructure is more or less destroyed by the war. And it takes a long, long time for the region to recover economically. And there's no Marshall Plan for the South. The expectation is that they brought this on themselves, and now they've got to rebuild on themselves. On their own effort, on their own steam. Of course, that overlooks the fact that a number of white Southerners were against the war from beginning to end. In fact, about 100,000 white men from the Confederate states actually served in the Union Army. But the Northern economy gets a big boost from the war. Government spending shoots up dramatically, and that has a kind of a reverberating effect. Merchants all over the North start to make more money than they've ever made. If they get contracts supplying uniforms for the army, or harnesses and bridles for the cavalry units, whatever. So you have people in the North who are prospering, and some of them are making very impressive fortunes. So the war has a diametrically different effect on the two economies. It's really a different as night and day.
Okay, okay, wow. Now, I can ask you, there's so much information in this book. Have you ever thought about doing a documentary for this book or any of your other books that you have
I would love to do a documentary. I mean, if somebody out there, if there's a filmmaker listening and he thinks this is a good idea, please contact me at Ohio State University. I think that would be a great idea. Nobody's approached me about that, but I'd be happy to cooperate.
One more question before we get out of here. Now, are you working on any books right now? Any other projects?
Yes, I am. My next book is about a family in Kentucky, the Shelby family, and their history from the late 18th century to the late 19th century. Obviously, the Revolution, Civil War, post-war. It's a family that left a lot of manuscripts. The first governor of the state was a man named Isaac Shelby. They were highly literate. They wrote a lot of letters. They kept diaries. In the late 19th century, one of the women in the family became a novelist and wrote a good deal about the war experience. And also, they left a lot of material objects behind. The first governor, Isaac Shelby, was a combat vet from the Revolution, and he collected artifacts off of the battlefields at the end of engagements. And he kind of got the family into this habit of collecting relics. And a lot of them are out there in the museums, very interesting. And also, some of them left behind houses that are still standing. So in this book, I get to write about the material world, but in a different way and a longer time frame. It's been really fun.
Right. That sounds very interesting. Wow, that's amazing. So yeah, I want
Thank
to
you.
thank. Yeah, it's an honor. I want to thank you again for coming on the platform. I truly appreciate the work that you have done already. I definitely look forward to the work that you have coming in the future.
Thank you, Taye. I've enjoyed it very much. It's been nice to meet you across the
Likewise.
ocean.
Right. I want to thank the viewers for tuning in as well.